Last week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a controversial law. He calls it an anti-riot law. It allows police to crack down on Floridians who are involved in protests that turn violent. Now, deputies in South Florida are being told not to enforce that law. That's according to an internal memo from Broward County. The sheriff's office reportedly said that they, quote, don't need any overzealous deputies using the law to violate people's civil liberties.
So social justice groups, others, they filed a lawsuit against DeSantis in response to that law. Host of the New York Times, The Argument, Jane Coaston, she joins us now to discuss. It's good to see you, Jane. Your paper actually is the one who brought this to our attention. I believe there's multiple different state legislatures. One even trying to absolve someone of running people over, probably not something that you want to encourage. So what do you make of this in the broader context of arguments around civil liberties, post-January 6th, post-riots, all of that?
Well, I think that one of the interesting things with both this bill in Florida and the bill in Oklahoma that has to do with permitting people to run people over is that it gives the people who have written it cover to say, oh, we're just very concerned about rioting. I believe that some of the language legislators in Florida used is, we don't want to be another Portland or something like that, which whatever you think of the situation that's been taking place in Portland, a lot of people, that 4 blocks, you don't want that. But the challenge here is that this law, HB1, is incredibly vague. And it basically gives law enforcement officials the ability to say, this protest, I don't like it. So it's unlawful assembly. And that means that everyone who's arrested from the unlawful assembly that the law enforcement has just decided it was, gets arrested and held for an entire evening. And it grants police officers really broad discretion that perhaps they shouldn't get to have about who should be arrested and who should be charged with a third-degree felony, which would then result in them losing the right to vote and losing a host of other rights, and deciding who doesn't have to be arrested. I think that one of the challenges we're seeing here is that this bill is allowing law enforcement to pick and choose who is protesting in the right way and who is protesting in the wrong way. And we all like to think, DeSantis made this point, that what the right way to protest is taking a knee, well, depending on if you're the National Football League, but the wrong way to protest is breaking windows. But we've seen time and time again that protests that are visibly peaceful can be termed to be unlawful because it's protesting police violence. And I think an interesting piece that I'm not sure if you've gotten a chance to look into is that this law allows the governor's office to seize control of budgets for municipal police departments if people in those localities have decided that they want to reduce the funding of those police budgets. Whoa. So it basically gives the governor's mansion a huge amount of power through a commission to say that, yes, this small town may have voted to reallocate funding to different areas outside of police, but we just can't let them have that. And there's also a cyber intimidation by publication component of this bill, which states that there's essentially a heckler's veto over publication about public officials, which they say is about, oh, we need to reduce the harm that could happen to public officials, but it's definitely going to be used by law enforcement to censor images and videos, including those body cam images that have been so important to how people are rethinking policing right now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. And you laid out, how broad ranging this is, not only in Florida, across the country. This is from The Times, Reed Epstein. Republicans in 34 states have introduced legislation to crack down on protesters. They'd bar people from student loans and state aid. They'd boost penalties for unlawful assembly. And even in some cases, immunize drivers who strike protesters in the street, which is what you guys are talking about. This kind of seems to go against all of the recent Republican rhetoric around cancel culture and free speech and censorship. I mean, this is incredibly dangerous. It seems to be potentially unconstitutional. And I would say the same thing to the right that I say to the left all the time on these issues, people who are cheering for, say, social media censorship, is, look, this may be targeted at your opponents today, but that doesn't mean that's where it's going to stay. You give the state and you give law enforcement these kind of tools, they can go after anyone, and it may not always be the other side that's being hurt by this.
Exactly. And I think that the understanding from these Republican legislatures is that they will always be the ones in power and their views will always be the ones in power. But that's absolutely not how you can think about civil liberties. You have to assume that the civil liberties for the people you detest are the ones you have to protect the most.
Yes.
And so I was thinking about this in terms of, like, anti-abortion protesters, the people who stand outside
that's a good
abortion
point.
clinics, where we've already seen the Supreme Court say that, like, yes, they can be there. There's been a lot of legal back and forth about that issue. In a blue state with this kind of bill, if someone were to arrest those protesters, would they be able to get some sort of recompense? I think that it's important to recognize that clearly Republicans are assuming that these protests are going to be about things they don't want people to be protesting. They don't want people to be protesting police misconduct. They don't want people to be protesting against a law enforcement. Again, that a lot of these bills have been posited as being pro-law enforcement, though no one really consulted police about this. I think there's a lot of cosplay happening of people thinking that they're doing things on behalf of law enforcement without really consulting them, especially as Broward County, as you just mentioned, was just saying that, like, we should not be giving overzealous deputies more power. But again, you have to remember that the speech of the people you oppose the most is the speech you need to protect the most, because again, it will come to you. It will happen to you. The speech that matters the most to you will be hindered by laws such as this, especially laws that give not just localities more power, but also take away power from localities and give more to the state government.
You know, and that is something which I thought would at least be learned in the wake of January 6th. Because you saw after January 6th,
no one learns anything.
You know, you're right. But it's like they're tapping congressional phone. The FBI is like tapping like members of Congress's phone records and like without a warrant, you know, just like grabbing it out of the cell tower, you know, looking at people's phones. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the National Guard. Then there are all these calls for a new domestic terror law. And people are like, wait, this is crazy. This is not what you want in terms of utilizing the power of the state. And it just seems to be that if you have, eventually, and this is another point I've been trying to make, I'm like, look, guys, like, you're not in power nationally. Like, this, if it's going to happen and you normalize this type of behavior on the state level, they'll just do it on the national level and use it against you. So the only way to make sure that you don't do that is to, you know, quote unquote, fire first. And yet we seem like a never-ending spiral to the bottom for this.
Exactly. Perhaps Senator Rand Paul can take some time from yelling at Anthony Fauci to focus on this particular issue, because it is a massive concern for civil liberties. It's just that the civil liberties of the people in question maybe don't matter as much to the people in power.
Yeah. And, you know, to Rand's credit, he did speak out on the police issue. Let's see if he comes out on this one. Thanks, Jane. Really appreciate it.
Great to see you, Jane. Thank you. More Rising for you all after this.